A narcissist does not live on memory, nor do they live on love in the way people commonly understand it. They are not nourished by the past, nor guided by genuine attachment. What keeps them alive is the emotional movement of others, the oscillation, the waiting, the gaze that still turns toward them. As long as you continue to hope, to imagine that one day they will understand, awaken, or become a different version of themselves, you are still breathing on behalf of a structure that cannot breathe on its own. You are keeping the rhythm for an ego without lungs. You are supplying oxygen to a self that cannot sustain itself. And you do this unconsciously, because you give that behavior a name that sounds beautiful, humane, and flattering to one's sense of virtue. Hope. Hope keeps you staying longer than necessary. Hope makes you keep explaining, keep enduring, keep adjusting yourself to preserve the possibility that something might still happen. But at a deeper level, your hope is not merely an emotion. It is a function. It prevents the narcissist's inner world from collapsing. It sustains the illusion that they still have weight, still have influence, still remain the center of some emotional orbit. You are not just loving them, you are anchoring them to reality. According to Carl Jung, there are people who are not held together by a mature self developed from within, but by continuous reflections from the external world. They need to be seen in order to exist. They need reactions in order to feel real. As long as the reflection remains, the persona stands upright, the narrative runs smoothly, and the illusion of power, value, and identity is maintained. But when the reflection disappears, not because it is taken away, not because of betrayal, but simply because no one steps into that position anymore, there is nothing left to hold on to. No ground, no axis, no gravitational pull. Detachment, therefore, is not coldness, nor is it punishment. It is silence that has completed understanding. It is a state in which you no longer need answers to feel at peace, no longer need confessions to find closure, no longer need to witness their consequences in order to allow yourself to keep living. You do not leave to escape. You leave because you withdrew from the role long ago, internally. Your body may still exist in their memory, but your mind no longer stands within that orbit. And it is precisely from this moment, unseen by anyone, without any dramatic spectacle, that the narcissist begins to drift into a space of weightlessness, a place with no confirming gaze, no regulating reactions, no emotional rhythm to cling to and call existence. The collapse does not arrive as an explosion. It comes as a quiet disorientation, when a structure that once lived by leaning on you is no longer being supported. This video is not about victory, nor about right and wrong. It speaks of a far subtler shift, a shift in which, when the empath stops hoping, the world does not collapse loudly, but a system that depended on you for a very long time quietly dissolves from within. At first, they do not appear as a narcissist. If they did, you would not have stayed. They enter your life in the form of a dream lover, someone who sees you, listens to you, mirrors you with an almost absolute attention. Their gaze seems to say, "Finally, someone understands me." Their voice touches layers within you that you once believed no one could reach. And you, with the heart of an empath, are not merely loved, you are seen. That is why the initial moment imprints so deeply. It is not just a memory. It becomes an inner standard. In that phase, you do not love them as a specific person. You love the state they awaken within you, a state in which you are allowed to be yourself, gentle, open, present, without having to be on guard. They are not only a lover, they become a doorway that leads you back to a very primal part of yourself. And when someone once gave you that feeling of coming home, your mind does not remember them as an individual, but as an origin point. Then the change begins. Not abruptly, not dramatically. It unfolds like a shift in seasons, slow enough for you to adapt, subtle enough that you cannot quite name it. The initial warmth does not disappear immediately. it simply becomes inconsistent. Intimate moments grow less frequent. Presence becomes erratic. Words that once made you feel safe begin to blur with ambiguity. But precisely because they were once the dream lover, you do not interpret this change as a warning. You give it a familiar, humane name. The difficulties of love. Empaths do not hope because they are naive. They hope because they have memory, and that memory is not imagined. It was real. You once touched a version of them, or at least a version they showed you beautiful enough for you to believe that this was their true self. And so, when they become cold, distant, or unpredictable, you do not think you are facing a different structure. You think they have strayed from themselves, and that love's task is to patiently wait for them to return. This is where the empath's hope begins. In the belief that human nature is stable, that something beautiful which once appeared cannot completely disappear, that change is only temporary, and that if you love enough, understand enough, and are generous enough, what once existed will come back. In your mind, the relationship has not collapsed, it is merely passing through a rough stretch. And love, as you understand it, means staying through those stretches. You begin telling yourself a familiar story. Everyone goes through hard times. Everyone has periods of withdrawal. Real love does not abandon each other when things are no longer perfect. You use the language of maturity to justify signs your intuition has been trying to warn you about. You do not deny the pain, you rationalize it. And in that process, hope ceases to be an emotion. It becomes a strategy for emotional survival. What very few empaths realize is this. Their hope is not oriented toward the future, but toward the past. They are not waiting for something new to happen. They are waiting for something old to return. They wait for the original gaze, the original consistency, the original sense of safety. And so, each time the narcissist returns with a familiar gesture, a gentle message, a vague promise, a sudden moment of intimacy, hope is reignited. Not because the present has improved, but because the past has briefly flickered back to life. From Carl Jung's perspective, when a person does not possess a stable self, they can perform highly convincing fragments of identity without long-term attachment to them. What the empath touched at the beginning was not necessarily a whole person, but an idealized persona, an image designed to reflect exactly what you were seeking. And because that persona once existed, when it disappears, the empath does not think an illusion has collapsed. They think it is a temporary misalignment. From there, hope transforms into waiting. You begin reading signals, guessing intentions, tracking every subtle shift in tone, distance, and silence. You believe that if you are perceptive enough, sensitive enough, you will find the key to reopen the old door. But what you do not realize is this. While you are waiting for them to return to who they once were, you are slowly moving away from yourself. You no longer live fully in the present. You live in a suspended space where everything is measured against a time that has already passed. And it is precisely the belief that this is just a difficult phase of love that keeps the empath staying longer than anyone else would. Because for them, leaving is not merely ending a relationship. Leaving means admitting that the beauty that once existed was not a foundation, but a spark. And that is a deeply painful truth, because it forces you to question not only them, but your own capacity to see clearly. So, the empath hopes. Not because they are weak, but because they once believed. And that belief, once so beautiful, gradually becomes the thread that keeps them bound to a structure they do not realize is operating on their waiting. At a certain point, hope no longer resembles love. It changes its name, but you do not notice. It stops being the longing to see the original gaze again and becomes the effort to keep everything from collapsing. You are no longer loving in the sense of opening and receiving. You are carrying. This shift happens very quietly. There is no clear moment marking the boundary between loving and carrying, only that you begin paying more attention to their state than to your own. You learn to speak less so as not to upset them. You learn to wait for the right time to share, and eventually you stop sharing altogether. You believe this is the maturity of love, knowing how to endure, how to yield, how to place us before me. But in truth, this is the moment you begin shrinking yourself to fit a structure that is becoming increasingly distorted. At this stage, hope no longer points toward the future, but toward damage control. You no longer ask, does this relationship nourish me? You ask, how can I keep things from getting worse? You no longer hope to be understood. You hope merely not to be misunderstood. Love is no longer a two-way flow. It becomes a form of emotional logistics where you constantly anticipate, adjust, and clean up after aftershocks you did not create. At a deeper level, something very dangerous occurs, a reversal. You stop treating your own emotions as meaningful data. Your sadness becomes too sensitive. Your hurt becomes a misunderstanding. Your intuition is labeled overthinking. And each time you dismiss yourself in this way, hope is reinforced. Not the hope that they will change, but the hope that if you change enough, everything will be okay. This is the point where love is replaced by unconscious responsibility. You are no longer in the relationship as someone being loved, but as someone managing their emotional state. You monitor their highs and lows the way you would monitor the weather. You learn to endure long cold spells, telling yourself, everyone goes through times like this. You begin to feel exhausted, yet you do not allow yourself to stop, because stopping would mean looking straight at a hard truth, that this relationship is now functioning only because of your endurance. What keeps an empath stuck for so long is not the fear of losing them, but the fear of losing meaning. Because once you have invested too much effort, too much patience, too many rounds of excusing someone else, leaving is not just leaving a person, it is admitting that all of that striving led nowhere. Hope becomes the rope that holds you in place, not because it is gentle, but because it has wrapped itself too deeply into your identity. And while you are carrying the weight, the other side does not experience it as sacrifice. They experience it as self-evident. Because when someone always stays, always adjusts, always endures, the narcissistic structure reads that as confirmation, that they do not have to change in order to be loved, that the world will bend around them, that someone else will continue to do the hardest part, making everything look fine. Right here, a subtle kind of loss takes place. You do not lose them first. You lose yourself first. You lose your ability to recognize what is a boundary, what is a legitimate need, what is the inner voice that used to be so clear. You begin to doubt your own feelings more than you doubt their behavior, and that is the sign that hope has gone too far. It is no longer a guiding light, but a burden pulling you away from your own center. Yet, from this same point, something else begins to spark, even if it is still very faint. A fatigue that can no longer be explained away. Not tired from arguments, but tired from always being the one who keeps the rhythm. Not hurt from being wounded, but hurt from having to constantly deny your own wounds. This fatigue does not demand that you act immediately. It only whispers one sentence that is very different from hope. This is not the love you once entered. And that whisper, if you do not extinguish it, becomes the beginning of a completely different movement, not leaving in rage, not awakening in drama, but a very slow, very deep shift from carrying the weight to releasing the role. That moment does not arrive as a shocking revelation. It does not hit you with a clear truth you can point to and say, here it is. It comes more slowly, more subtly, and therefore more painfully. It is when you begin to realize that your emotions are no longer received, only managed. You are no longer loved as a human being with an inner life of your own, but kept as a function, a mechanism that allows everything around them to continue running smoothly. This realization often begins with a very small detail. Maybe it is the time you were genuinely exhausted, and their response was only irritation. Maybe it is the moment you needed comfort, but instead you were told you were too much, too sensitive at the wrong time. Not because they do not understand you, but because your emotional state disrupts their stability. And suddenly you see something strange. Your emotions are only acceptable when they do not cause disturbance. From there, you begin to look at the relationship through a different lens. You see that your presence is always needed when they are unstable, confused, or empty, yet becomes inconvenient when you need space for yourself. You see that you are sought out not to be loved, but to regulate, to soothe, to fill the void, to keep their life from falling into chaos. And gradually, you understand. You are no longer chosen for who you are. You are kept for the role you are carrying. From Carl Jung's perspective, when a person has not developed a sufficiently solid self, they lean on others as regulating objects to maintain a sense of existence. In such a structure, the empath is not seen as an independent subject, but as an extension of the system. You are not loved because you are you, but because you help them avoid facing emptiness they cannot tolerate on their own. The most painful moment is not when you realize you are being used. It is when you realize it has been happening for a long time, only you have called it by other names. Sacrifice, understanding, maturity, unconditional love. You begin to see that every time you try to voice your needs, the conversation is quickly redirected back to their feelings, their struggles, their pain, and very skillfully, you become the comforter again, even inside the story of your own hurt. Here, an important boundary begins to form in you, not through logic, but through a sense of emptiness. You are present, but no longer reached. You give, but you are no longer received in a nourishing way. You begin to feel as if you are standing in a room where everything needs you, but nowhere is there a place for you. And for the first time, you allow yourself to ask the question you once avoided. If I disappeared from this role, would they still want me? That question is not meant to accuse them. It exposes another truth. Real love does not require you to become the foundation of someone else's stability. Love does not need you to constantly flatten conflicts you did not create. And when you see that, hope begins to lose its footing, not because you have become harder, but because you can no longer deceive yourself that this is love. This realization does not immediately make you leave, but it does something very important. It cracks the role. You no longer fully inhabit it the way you used to. You begin to slow down, repair less, explain less, carry less on their behalf. And even if you cannot name it yet, a quiet movement has begun. You are slowly withdrawing energy from the stabilizing function, and for the first time, the structure begins to feel the deficit. The narcissist does not sit down and consciously realize that you have withdrawn from the stabilizing role. They cannot name what has changed, but inside them, something that was always there is no longer there. It is like walking into a familiar room and sensing that the air has thinned no obvious sign, only that breathing is no longer full in the same way. At first, they do not assume it has anything to do with you. They think it is passing fatigue, external pressure, a day that is simply off. But very quickly, they realize that something is no longer responding the way it used to. Behaviors that once created a reaction, deliberate silence, coldness, ambiguity, now cannot land anywhere. Not because you are fighting back, but because there is no surface left to collide with. This is the crucial point. A narcissist does not live on another person's presence, but on another person's orientation toward them. As long as you remain in the stabilizing role, even in pain or exhaustion, you are still a reference point. Every state of theirs, anxiety, rage, emptiness, still has somewhere to be discharged, tested, regulated. But when you withdraw your energy from that position, the system loses the external self-balancing mechanism it has always relied on. From Jung's perspective, an ego that has not individuated cannot maintain a sense of existence without reflection. That is why this deficit is not experienced as losing a person, but as losing inner orientation. They do not know what they are sad about. They do not know why restlessness is increasing. They do not know why what once made them feel powerful now feels ineffective. They only know the familiar rhythm has shifted. What is notable is that, at this stage, the narcissist often has not hoovered yet, has not tried to pull you back in any obvious way, because they still believe the old order will correct itself. They are used to the world bending around them, so they assume this is only a temporary misalignment. But beneath that, a very different kind of insecurity is forming. The loss of being anchored. This deficit shows up in subtle ways. It may look like irritability for no reason, a hollow feeling that appears even when someone else is beside them, a need to check, to probe, without knowing what they are looking for, a sense that everything becomes bland faster, that every interaction is not enough, not because the world has changed, but because the role of keeping the rhythm no longer has someone doing it. At this point, the narcissist still has not consciously recognized that you have removed the access, but their body and nervous system have already registered the absence. And that is why panic, if it comes, will not come as a logical response, but as a chain of dysregulated, inconsistent behaviors, sometimes contradicting the very image they try to maintain. The persona begins to slip, not because it is being attacked, but because it no longer has a ground to stand on. Most importantly, this deficit cannot be filled immediately by someone else, because what has been lost is not mere attention, but a familiar function, the function of regulating, reflecting, and stabilizing. And when that function disappears, before it can even be named, the narcissist enters a state that is very dangerous for them, a void they do not know what to do with. From here, everything becomes only a matter of time. Not time for them to understand, but time for the old system to no longer be able to patch itself back together. And in this quiet interval before hoovering, before any eruption, the collapse has already begun, even though it has not yet taken a form that outsiders can recognize. Then there will come a moment very different from anything the narcissist has experienced before, when they not only feel that something is missing, but realize that you have completely withdrawn from the system. Not because you have become colder, not because you have become angrier, but because there is nothing in you responding to them anymore. No waiting for them to turn back. No longing for an explanation. No tremor in your inner world at their presence or absence. And that non-orienting silence triggers their deepest survival reflex. At first, they try to keep everything normal. They approach you with familiar gestures, familiar tones, as if re-establishing the old context will automatically bring back your old role. In their mind, order cannot disappear because of such a subtle shift. They assume you are only out of rhythm, and that the familiar rhythm will correct itself. But when they do not get the expected reaction, not resistance, but being untouched, they begin to feel a different kind of unease. Unease because there is no longer a point to anchor their behavior. From there, they turn to the past, not to reminisce, but to pull you back into an old version of yourself. Beautiful memories are named at precisely the right moments. Intimate scenes are recalled with an accuracy that is almost cold. They do not say they miss you. They make you remember who you used to be when you were with them. This is an attempt to strike identity, not emotion. But when you have truly detached, memory is no longer a doorway back. It is only an image that has lost its gravitational pull. And that very ineffectiveness is what makes them start to panic. That panic does not show itself in tears or confession. It shows itself in reversing the story. You, the one who once loved, endured, stayed, suddenly become the heartless one, the one who changed, the one who is not like before. Your detachment is dressed in moral labels to activate guilt, because if you explain, if you defend yourself, if you enter the dialogue, you have returned to the old position. But when you do nothing, when you refuse that role, their story begins to lose its audience and the persona begins to slip. When the soft psychological chords no longer work, they move to a deeper layer, crisis. It may look like emotional breakdown, emptiness, illness, or emergencies revealed at the exact moment you withdraw. It is not always fabricated, but it always serves an unconscious purpose: to awaken the empath's rescuer instinct. If you return in the role of soothing, softening, caring, the system is restored. But when you do not step in, not out of hatred, but because you have already withdrawn from the role, they face a reality that is deeply unsettling. Not every pain will be rescued. At this stage, they often try to prove you are no longer important. Someone else appears quickly displayed, idealized, showcased as evidence that they are fine. But this is not a true replacement. It is a mirror erected in haste. And when you are no longer the one holding the mirror, the performance becomes so hollow that even they can feel its falseness. Finally, when none of these approaches produces a response, they retreat into silence. Not the silence of healing, but the silence of testing, a step back to see if you will step forward, a gap to test one last time whether the cord still connects or has snapped. And when you do not step forward, not out of anger, but because you were no longer there from within, something final collapses. Not the relationship, but the illusion that they still have access to your inner world. From Carl Jung's perspective, when a persona is no longer mirrored, the shadow floods upward. And these reactions are not sophisticated tactics, but the panicked instincts of a structure that has lost its ground. You do not need to do anything to make them collapse. You only need to no longer stand in the position that keeps them standing. And in that undramatic withdrawal, the game ends not because someone loses, but because you have left the stage. After all those unconscious efforts, there is a very quiet moment the narcissist is never prepared to face. No new behavior left to try. No tactic strong enough to pull you back into the old position. No feedback to analyze. No fluctuation to cling to. The outer world continues, but their inner order begins to enter a state of self-consumption. This is not the dramatic collapse people often imagine. It is closer to a machine running without load for too long, no loud sound, but each internal part heating up, grinding down, until it can no longer hold its original form. The first thing that disappears is a sense of orientation. When you were still there, in any role, you were still a reference point. Every emotion of theirs, confidence or insecurity, power or injury, had a place to compare itself against. When that point disappears, they no longer know whether what they feel is right or wrong, normal or threatening. Anxiety rises without a clear cause. Emptiness stretches with no exit. Moments of self-doubt appear that they cannot blame on anyone. And what terrifies them most is not pain, it is the lack of direction. From lack of direction, they slide into another state, self-surveillance. Before, your gaze was the mirror that told them who they were. Now, without that mirror, they are forced to look at themselves, but they do not have the internal tools to do so. This self-observation does not lead to insight. It leads to confusion. They notice constant mood shifts, excessive reactions, anger without an object. But instead of understanding this as structural deficit, they experience it as a threat to the image they still struggle to maintain. In this phase, many narcissists fall into a very specific kind of exhaustion, not tired from loving, but tired from having to continuously recreate the persona without any feedback to confirm its effectiveness. They still go out, still talk, still appear fine, but inside there is an unnamed depletion. What once thrilled them becomes bland. New relationships no longer provide lasting validation. Everything requires more stimulation, more attention, but the effect grows shorter and shorter. This is when they begin chasing sensation instead of living within stable feeling. And right here, something paradoxical happens. The image of you begins to harden into a fixed form. When you were still reacting, your image in their mind could always be edited, idealized, devalued, blurred. But when you fully detach, that image is no longer updated. It freezes in a position that is deeply disturbing, uncontrollable, uneditable, untouchable. You are no longer a living person inside their system. You become a symbol of lost access, and that fixation makes you impossible for them to process the way they process other objects. From here, they begin to experience a kind of obsession that does not take its familiar shape, not missing you out of love, but being haunted by an absence that cannot be filled. You are not present to be idealized and not present to be devalued. You are simply not there, and that breaks the entire logic of their operating system. They may tell others different stories about you, but when they are alone, no story is strong enough to soothe this void. More importantly, at this stage, the narcissist begins facing consequences without you standing in between to absorb them. Inner contradictions, buried shame, feelings of worthlessness that were once pushed onto you now return wave after wave. And because they lack inner emotional skills, each wave is felt like an internal attack. This is when many of them search for new ways to avoid overworking, addiction to stimulation, constant attention seeking, or total withdrawal from emotional depth. Meanwhile, what happens on your side is entirely different. Not explosive happiness, not the feeling of victory, but a silence with an axis. You begin to feel your own weight again, no longer having to adjust yourself to keep someone else stable. The empty spaces that once got filled with monitoring, guessing, and anticipating now become room for real presence. You do not need to think about them much anymore, not because you are forcing yourself to forget, but because your system has stopped revolving around them. This difference, one side increasingly self-consuming, the other slowly stabilizing, creates an irreversible distance. Not because one is right and one is wrong, but because the two of you no longer exist inside the same structure of reality. You cannot return to the old role without destroying your own process, and they cannot enter your new space without facing the very emptiness they have always avoided. This is where many narcissistic stories end in silence. No apology, no recognition, no clear conclusion. Yet that lack of conclusion is the clearest sign that the system has completed its cycle. You do not need to close the door. You do not need to lock it. You simply no longer stand in the doorway. And when no one stands there, the door itself becomes meaningless. The narcissist's collapse, if it can even be called that, is not an event. It is a process of disintegration, slow, quiet, and without witnesses. And the empath's freedom is not a glorious moment either. It is a very quiet return to yourself, where you no longer have to keep someone else alive at the cost of your own life. And that is the true ending. Not when they let go of you, but when you are no longer the condition for their stability. There is a very quiet truth that only at the end of this journey does the empath become calm enough to face. That relationship does not end with an action. It ends with an inner withdrawal, not the day you leave, not the day they go silent, but the day you no longer need them to change in order for your life to move forward. The day you stop placing hope in some other version of them to justify your staying. That is the day the game truly ends, even if no one ever announces it out loud. Many people believe that winning in a narcissistic relationship means seeing the narcissist collapse. But that is only the final illusion of a wounded ego. Because if you still need to witness their downfall in order to feel free, then part of the old role is still alive. Real freedom arrives when you no longer stand inside the orbit of comparison. When you no longer measure yourself by their state, no longer ask, do they regret it? Did they lose anything? Do they miss me? Those questions were once painfully real, but there comes a time when they fall away on their own, not because you force yourself to let go, but because you are no longer standing in the place that needs an answer. From Carl Jung's perspective, true maturation is not about defeating another person's shadow. It is about reclaiming the parts of your energy that were bound in the unconscious. You do not move beyond the narcissist by proving anything. You move beyond them by no longer allowing your life to revolve around their story. You do not need to play the role of being more awakened, stronger, or more moral. You only need to return to being a person with an inner axis living from the inside out, rather than reacting to the outside world. At this point of ending, the greatest change is not your emotion, but your way of being present. You no longer live in vigilance. You no longer have to read between the lines. You no longer brace yourself for sudden shifts. Life does not become perfect, but it becomes real. New relationships, if they come, do not need drama to prove depth. Calm no longer makes you suspicious or bored. You begin to distinguish between peace and emptiness disguised as stimulation. What must be made clear here is this. Detachment does not turn you into a cold person. On the contrary, it returns to you the ability to love without erasing yourself. You still have compassion, but it is compassion with boundaries. You still understand, but you no longer carry it for them. You do not close your heart, you simply close the door to structures that demand you sacrifice your identity in order to keep them alive. And if you look back, you will see that this entire journey was never meant to heal the narcissist. It was meant to bring you back to yourself. What happens to them afterward, the emptiness, the disorientation, or their capacity to face themselves, no longer belongs to the story you need to follow. Not because you are indifferent, but because you have returned responsibility to its rightful owner. Each person must carry their own inner structure, and that is not something love can do on someone else's behalf. Perhaps, at some point in the future, you will look back on this relationship without heaviness. Not because it didn't matter, but because you have placed it where it belongs. It is no longer the wound that defines you. It becomes a stretch of road you once traveled, where you learned the most valuable thing of all. Love is not a place where you have to disappear so that someone else can exist. And if there is one thing that must be engraved at the end of this journey, it is this. You did not leave because you lost. You left because you completed the role. You did not abandon anyone. You simply stopped being the foundation for a structure that never intended to stand on its own legs. The silence afterward is not a void. It is a new space for you to live, to breathe, and to be present as a whole human being. It is an ending without a climax, no applause, but it is the real ending. And from that very silence, another life begins, no longer needing to be validated, no longer needing to prove anything, needing only to be lived with the full weight of who you are.